Excuse me. Sorry. January, and the month began with the sad passing of Zombie Studios, creators of Blacklight Retribution and the original Spec Ops series. No, not that one. Thankfully, ex-employees have reformed, creating a new studio, Hardsuit Labs. There was bad news also for over 300 Sega employees who were offered voluntary redundancy due to restructuring, with the firm belief they are concentrating more on mobile and online rather than consoles. Nintendo also joined the fray this month by closing Club Nintendo, and if you add in Sony apologising for the previous year's Christmas PSN outage, then this was a rather depressing month indeed. Truthfully, even the game releases this month were rather lukewarm. Remasters of Resident Evil and Grim Fandango were released within a week of each other, continuing this seemingly endless trend of remasters, remakes and special editions that feel like a never-ending circle of nostalgia. This year alone, we've seen Fahrenheit Indigo Prophecy, System Shock, Homeworld, Devil May Cry 4, Uncharted, God of War 3 and Gears of War all get brand spanking new visuals on new editions. Now, personally, I'm conflicted by all this. On the one hand, it keeps these games alive for longer and introduces them to a new audience, which is great. But on the other hand, it just seems completely pointless, and at times can even sully your original experience of the game itself. Resident Evil HD, for example, is technically a remaster of the original GameCube remake, making it a remake HD Special Edition. Does it all really matter though? Case in point, here's Grim Fandango in full HD glory, and here's the original. I'm not saying there isn't a difference, I'm just saying the difference is so inane when the gameplay and puzzles remain exactly the same. Mind you, Resident Evil HD, one of the best selling games of the year, so that shows what I know. Thankfully, all was not lost thanks to another chirpy zombie game, and let's face it, we haven't had enough of those recently. Dying Light from Techland, the developers of Dead Island, felt like Mirror's Edge crossed with, well, Dead Island I suppose. It was fine, some interesting elements with a nicely executed parkour, soundtrack and RPG elements, not to mention the intriguing day and night cycle. Sadly, the novelty did start to wear off after a couple of hours, but a decent effort all the same. Other interesting new releases this month: Life is Strange, an episodic series with a superb female protagonist and well-written story. Finally, Citizens of Earth, a somewhat humorous if rather simplistic Earthbound-inspired role-playing game. Evolve started off the month, and after those trailers and footage you might think to yourself, well, that looks awesome. It wasn't. All was not lost, however, particularly for Nintendo fans who had both Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask 3D and Kirby and the Rainbow Curse to sink their teeth into. But the strangest release this month was the PS4 exclusive The Order 1886, which sadly for most just fell completely flat. Firstly, it was ridiculously short at 4 to 5 hours with no multiplayer component. Ready at dawn, the developers claimed it was more like 10 hours, which may have been true if you've just come out of a coma or you sat on your ass for 4 hours and just looked at the title screen. It should also be mentioned that 4 of these 5 hours were also men with porn star moustaches and beards bellowing The second biggest issue was the decision to have the game be played in widescreen letterbox resolution. This is fine if you have a fancy pants TV. I didn't, which meant I had to squeeze up right in front of mine just to see anything. Truthfully, it wasn't the worst game released this year. Visually, it looks great, and they at least tried aiming for a more differing cinematic scope, one to chalk under failed experiment. Other interesting games this month: Grow Home, a game in which a robot straddled phallic objects for 2 hours, and Resident Evil Revelations 2 Episode 1, the Claire and Barry Sandwich Edition HD Remake Master. March, and Sony were busy with further revelations regarding their Project Morpheus project and the announcement of the ending of their PlayStation Mobile service in summer. Nintendo also got chins wagging with their attempts to break into the mobile and tablet market, but perhaps the biggest story of the month involved Konami, who began their annus horribilis by removing Hideo Kojima's name from Metal Gear Solid 5 branding. Game releases began with the release of YouTube favourite Five Nights at Freddy's 3. It was the battle of the exclusive this month, with Ori and the Blind Forest in Microsoft's corner and Bloodborne in Sony's. The former was a solid platformer and well worth playing, but it was was the PS4's Bloodborne that truly won the day and was easily the best game released so far this year. Full of intense battles, a great levelling system and enticing Lovecraft-esque visuals and lore, the game took away hours of my life and caused more stress than I ever thought possible. It's incredible to think that literally hours of my life have been wasted thanks to From Software kicking my ass time and time again. Yet it's a true compliment to their skill as game developers that despite said ass kicking, I keep getting drawn back in and ready for one more go. Other essentials this month include Axiom Verge, a decent pastiche to the older Metroid games despite frustrating level navigation, plus City Skyline, the game the reboot of SimCity wished it was. April was rather slow in terms of news, with perhaps the biggest being the closing down of the cloud gaming service OnLive. Konami continued their self-implosion by cancelling the Silent Hills project, disappointing millions in the process, and I'm one of them. But there was good news this month as Yooka-Laylee, the spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, was announced for release next year. This month will perhaps be remembered as a period that the game industry went slightly nuts. The excellent roguesque rhythm game Crypt of the Necrodancer dazzled and stood out as a unique highlight of the year. Things took an even more surreal turn when Goat Simulator suddenly became a cult classic. The ultimate king of what the fuckery this month was the release of Iron Bread, a game which unsuccessfully attempted to make bread products interesting. It controlled like absolute crap, featured boring game modes and level design, yet underneath it all remained a strangely charming experience. Frankly, with sports games, first-person shooters and action games frequently shoved down our throats year on year, it's nice to get behind something which at least tries to stand out from the crowd. Leaving bread aside, the biggest game of this month was Mortal Kombat 10. Like the previous installment, it contained an immersive story mode, but it was obviously the fatalities which once again stood out. At times, the amount of blood and gore in this would make Tarantino blush, but there's something oddly alluring about virtually ripping someone's arm off or sawing them in two, and besides, it borders on the absurd most of the time anyway. You can't really take any of this seriously. It's a game which features a thunder gun and a character with 4 arms, for Christ's sake. It's hardly high art. Add in a great multiplayer component, decent controls along with additional modes, and you've got yourself one of the most entertaining games of the year. May, and it was great news for Nintendo as they signed a theme park deal with Universal Studios and recorded their first annual profit in over 4 years. Things got even better for them with the successful release of Splatoon, one of the best breakthrough hits of the year, and a prime example of how Nintendo can still be ahead of the pack when they want to be. BioWare also popped open the champagne and celebrated 20 years of existence. No doubt celebrations included recording 400 hours of dialogue no one in their right mind would listen to. Strangest story of the month though involved H1Z1 developers banning cheaters and then only reinstating them if they publicly apologised on YouTube, the virtual equivalent of the ducking stool. Project Cars was another solid standout this month, and while it struggled to reach the heights of Forza and Gran Turismo, it does at least have some merit, but it was the return of a certain Geralt of Rivia that got everyone truly giddy with excitement this month. Witcher 3 Wild Hunt was utterly wonderful. Not only did it feature beautiful graphics, soundtrack and excellent sandbox environments, but it's a prime example of how excellent writing and voice acting can truly elevate a game into almost classic status. The storyline for Witcher 3 is incredibly immersive, and this includes its various submissions and subplots. There are detractions regarding the treatment of the female characters in the game, which I understand, and the combat has been rather oversimplified, but the simple question here remains, do I want to remain in this world for as long as possible? And the answer to the question for many was a resounding yes. If you haven't found time for the white-haired one, then please do, it's well worth the effort. Finally, a quick mention for Invisible Incorporate, easily Clay Entertainment's best effort so far. June, annoyingly, began with one of the most controversial stories of the year.
This is the time of vengeance, and no life is worth saving. And I will put in the grave as many as I can. It's time for me to kill, and it's time for me to die.
Hatred arrived at the beginning of the month, and with its ultra-violent murderous attitude was a game clearly pandering to the idea of controversy sells. Now I'm not necessarily bothered by this, I take the attitude of many, which is that if you don't like something, you simply ignore it. Some things need to be said about Hatred. Firstly is the fact that representatives of the game claimed it was perhaps no different than the righteous anarchy of, say, anything from the Grand Theft Auto series. But there's a huge difference. Hatred enforces the violence, otherwise you can't progress, whereas the others offer a choice of whether or not you engage in any truly violent activity. Secondly, if you are going to do ultra-violence and controversy, at least make it interesting. Postal 2, for example, is crass, stupid and grossly offensive, but it manages to remain funny while doing so. Manhunt is a difficult playing experience, but it manages to be both tense and exhilarating. Hatred is woefully boring. I mean, to be fair, it managed to create an emotional response out of me for about 10 minutes. After 20 minutes, I was completely disinterested and couldn't be bothered with it, and that remains Hatred's biggest issue. Ultimately, it's like that kid at school that tried to be brash, outlandish and trendy, but all it really ended up doing was alienating the very people it was trying to impress. Avoid like the plague. Speaking of plagues, Mariah Carey signed a 7-figure deal to promote the free-to-play Game of War app. But as ever in June, most were preoccupied with the annual dick-waving contest that is E3. This year was much more interesting than the lackluster previous year. Microsoft announced backwards compatibility and this augmented reality voodoo, but most would argue that it was Sony that stood out above others. It announced a triple whammy. First with the release date of The Last Guardian, secondly with the announcement of the remake of Final Fantasy VII, and thirdly with the announcement of Shenmue 3's Kickstarter, although even that made grown adults act like this. Incredibly, the subsequent Kickstarter actually managed to break a world record. Her Story was also released this month with its intriguing use of narrative and live action, but most were probably too busy digging their teeth into Batman Arkham Knight to truly notice. The final instalment in Rocksteady's superb trilogy, Arkham Knight was a standout this year, although some might successfully argue that it was the weakest of the three. Its biggest flaw was perhaps its endless Batmobile sections, which felt entirely forced, and its slightly weaker storyline. A storyline with a twist which made no sense in Batman lore and had a heavy over-reliance on Hamill's Joker. But to mention this really is to do it a huge disservice. Arkham Knight was incredibly addictive and had enough hours to keep fans happy, provided you played it on a console.
I got nothing to say to you, Batman. Talk, or I'll crush every bone in your body.
Other highlights include D4 Dark Dreams Don't Die, Heroes of the Storm, and in many respects the worst game of the year, Alone in the Dark Illumination. If you wish to emulate the gameplay experience, stick your head down the toilet and take the toilet seat and then bang it against your head repeatedly for about half an hour, you'll probably get the same experience.